Good morning, everyone. It's already a challenge being speaker number 5. I have a lot of sympathy for speaker number 14 later on this afternoon, with much thunder having been stolen. I always have this philosophy when I do talks that I need to be prepared, although my colleagues think I wing it most of the time. That's not necessarily true. But that I also need to be able to be a little bit adaptive in looking at these things. And from the first few talks, much ground has been covered from a couple of perspectives. One is just from the perspective of how the higher education landscape is changing. Another is from how the knowledge landscape is changing. And something that I've always believed in, having come at higher education really as a historian and political scientist, is something about a multi-perspective, bringing different strands together. So in the coffee break, I travel around always with my memory stick that has about 7,000 PowerPoint presentations on it, and I can always find one for just the suitable occasion. So I've simply pulled one thing out, and I'd like to do something which may work and it may not work, but you're all a polite audience, so you'll clap either way. If I think about education, I try and think about it across multiple generations, because you have to. One of the things that I've tried to look at in the past few years is the neuroscience of education and change. Much of that literature is around small children. There's very little about adults and adult learning, so there's a whole thing that all of us in this room should probably engage with on memory, on retention, on synapse creation, especially on change, where you have to undo patterns, where the neuroscience really gives a big indication of what happens. But the reason I raise it today is because by the time you get to university, and we talk about the changing university landscape, you're kind of old. Not as old as we are in this room, but you're not 0 years old anymore either. So I popped up one that I thought was really very interesting. And what I'm going to try and do is put a timeline of 20 or 30 years on and build layers on it, at least mentally, not with 1 million PowerPoints, but for all of us to hopefully be able to give some thought to. So when you look at this, you realize very quickly that when children are born, they have the capacity to build millions of neuron connections. These connections are created by stimulus. And if brain is not stimulated, it atrophies very quickly. So basically from the time you're 1 week old, you're starting to lose brain capacity while also building brain capacity. By the time kids are 2 years old, 2-year-old kids from households where they're stimulated with books and languages, I guess books may be less and less in the future, screens and languages and people talking to them and playing with them, they're very quickly ahead of other children. By the time they're 4, they can be 2 years ahead of other 2-year-old children from poorer households who aren't stimulated, who are just basically parked as children. And as you move forward, you start to realize that in the first 18 years, a lot of development happens in the brain, spatially, etc., but higher levels of cognition aren't really there. You're not allowed to rent a car in most countries until you're 25, because your overall societal judgment is not that good when you're 18 or 16 when they give you a driver's license. It's very difficult for teenagers to make judgments about how what they do now affects the future. And this is simply very physiological. So there's a whole layer about how your brain functions that I think has to figure much more in the overall learning ecology for the future. You can put another layer on top of that, perhaps the layer of the parents of the 0 to 18-year-old. The parents, I propose, are actually looking for a babysitting service for a long time. Because even if we could all learn everything there is to know between the ages of 2 and 6, what are we going to do when we're 6? Get a job? No one's going to hire a 6-year-old. So there's something about the societal expectation of how life works. That we're kids, we get bigger, we get put into kindergarten to socialize. An interesting example for you is in the Netherlands, they start kids on their 4th birthday, and for the first 3 years, they just make them play. And the boys don't play so nicely, so they're not promoted to actually learning anything. They're told they're so good at playing, they should play another year. And it doesn't cause any stigma, they happily play. Girls are bright and diligent, and they get promoted a little bit earlier, and the boys just keep on playing. By the time they're supposed to learn something, aged 7, they learn to read and write in about 6 months. In the UK system, they make the little blighters learn to read and write aged 4. They should be playing aged 4. So a death trip is to move a 6-year-old from the Netherlands to the UK because they're in play mode, pre-learn mode, whereas the UK kids are being beaten to learn with standardized testing aged 0, basically. So you carry on then. What do you want to do with teenagers? Well, generally to lock them in their rooms until they become 20 and you can talk to them again, right? Why do you send them to university? Because no one really hires 17-year-olds, so they should become 21. Unfortunately, it's really expensive now in many countries to send them for adult babysitting. In the States, 100,000 in debt, 150,000 in debt. Serious crises among American friends saying their campuses are considered to be country clubs. The students are considered to be the members of the country club, and there's something that's disappearing around education. So the second layer on top of the neuroscience is simply the societal expectation for what to do with children as they grow up. And I think these two are interlinked. And they're wicked systems. They have been with us for many years, and to break out of them is really a big challenge. The third layer is something that we've been speaking about, which is this whole perspective of the availability of knowledge and what we do, most of us in this room, which is somehow deal with the educational experience, but also the business of knowledge, because they're linked, not in a bad way. I don't think that anyone in this room is here just to max out on profit, but there's something about keeping the show on the road. But knowledge is genuinely free now. So we've spoken a little bit about, are we in a position to bring something to the table when we think about the fact that kids and adults can acquire knowledge for nothing? What is it that they can't do? Without sounding like Rumsfeld, there is something about adjacent domains of knowledge. If you don't know something exists, that's something valuable for someone to point you in the direction of. If you're studying business, there's a lot of good stuff in sociobiology, but if you've never read sociobiology, didn't know it exists, or neuroscience and don't know it exists, there's something valuable there. So there are all these kinds of roles that we need to rethink for ourselves in terms of what our roles are. I can't remember who talked about the inversion of the classroom. At our place, we've done so on an MBA program. The pre-reading is all that difficult copyright stuff on are we allowed to send the MBA students to Michael Porter's strategy video on YouTube? Because why listen to me witter on about Porter when you can have Porter yourself? But please don't ask me whether we should be paying anyone copyrights to have a link to Michael Porter on YouTube for our MBA students. The cost of finding out is bigger than the benefit of finding out, it seems to me. So everything we do says, if you want to whine at us and you're really miserable, send a shitty little email and we'll take it off. And no one has so far. So a whole layer of the kind of knowledge space that's being inverted there. What are we trying to learn is another big question. There's a Finnish educationalist whose name unfortunately escapes me, that I was involved in a future of education thing a few years ago with some videos, and I couldn't find hers anymore, who says it is a bit ironic when we think about how the education system works in the abstract sense, because we're educating everybody to go to university. We're not really figuring out in many, many systems how many people should go to university, and in the UK certainly this is a terribly taboo subject, because everyone has opportunity, even if by the age of 3 or 4 they're already so far behind that someone from a poor estate is never going to get to Oxford or Cambridge if you're realistic about it. But that, you can't say that because that's like swearing in church. So Should there be more plumbing courses? Should there be more courses in media studies or in God knows what? It's a national level, international level question, probably in the too difficult box, but it's something that genuinely, I think, needs to be asked. If I look at some of the really interesting stuff happening in the same space, this particular academic from Finland says, if you think about what you need to know in life, is it something abstract? In the UK, you learn about the Tudors over and over again. They're very popular. Henry VIII comes up, and every single year, it seems to me, in the entire curriculum, from age 0 to age 18. And the present Minister of Education, an unpleasant fellow called Michael Gove, wants to make it even worse so that we learn even more about the Tudors. It just doesn't simply work for me. So the Finnish woman says we should learn things like how to cook, how to balance our bank statement, how to get from A to B, how to book something on Expedia, that there are certain life skills that are actually more important than Henry VIII. Recently I went to a talk by a guy called Tony Wagner, who was looking at this in a more proper way than I do, because he's polite and I'm a little bit less so. And he said the knowledge needs for the future are around critical thinking and problem solving, asking the right questions, and identifying the right problem. What is the perspective you're looking at things from? Is it in the narrow or is it in breadth? A second skill is around working with others, whether you have direct line control over them or not. It's collaborative, it's network driven. You need to be agile and adaptable. You need to be able to write. As an interesting aside, all my American teacher friends say that kids there do not know how to write cursive at all anymore. They kind of know how to print and kind of know how to text, but no one knows how to write joined up. No one under the age of 25 wears a watch anymore. There are all kinds of things happening there that are fascinating. I like it because it reminds me, and I'll come back to that, of my personal education experience that makes me the person I am today. But I was held back because my printing was so messy. They thought I'd never be able to write cursive. My cursive is less messy than my printing, but both are pretty messy. You need to have initiative and entrepreneurial skills. You need to be able to figure out what to do about big data. Google is free, but there's such a lot of rubbish out there that you need to be able to sort and sift. And you need curiosity and imagination. Is this what school at any point instills upon the youth? And I'm not looking to dump on big systems, but schools do not promote these things. We learn by rote. We have tests. We work, our kind of assessment is based on individual performance to make sure no one's free riding. There are a whole host of problems with educational systems that are not fitting us with the skills we need in a really broad sense. Wagner did some interesting work talking to people who were doing creative, interesting stuff. Asked them what their parents did for them. And their parents trotted them around to ballet lessons and piano lessons and sports lessons until the parents, I'm sure, were so sick of it that they wanted to give themselves the bullet. But the goal was to introduce the children to enough different stimuli that they were hopefully interested in something. And if they were passionate through intrinsic motivation about one thing, that stayed with them as they went through life. They weren't necessarily obsessive about Yu-Gi-Oh cards or about some sort of video game when they were 30. If they were, that's probably a problem, but they transferred their passion onto something else over time. This one freaks me out. They asked the same group of high achievers who influenced them the most in an educational setting. And they said at primary and secondary school, it was an outlier teacher who was in the doghouse. And in the university, it was someone who was not tenure track because they bucked the system as opposed to played to the system. And for any of you who have ever been to children's evenings with your kids' school and have interviewed the teachers, were you 100% convinced that 100% of them were really tuned in? I've never been. Many of the high achievers ended up at Montessori schools, which is of course a little bit strange, cutting corners off things and never doing maths, but we can all get over that. So we're looking at these different layers. I'd like to put another one on for you that I think is very interesting. Do we all watch TED Talks all the time ad infinitum? Most of you, if you do, will know the Ken Robinson thing, which kind of comes from the same perspective, that schools are not necessarily fit for purpose. One that I think is really super that I just saw recently is Sugata Mitra's about computer experiments, putting computers into poor Indian neighborhoods and just letting kids fart about with them. And they started pressing buttons. He said there was one with voice recognition that only understood the Queen's English, and the little Gujarati kids who spoke with some sort of Ahmedabad accent had to learn the Queen's English to be able to talk to the computer. They did that in 3 weeks amongst themselves. They started to learn all kinds of crazy stuff, and they found the best learning was 4 children playing around with a computer supported by a granny. So they created, and the granny was someone who said, "Good, good, good, you're really smart, you're really cute, keep at it." It didn't matter if the granny knew anything about the subject. It was purely encouragement. So this is, the particular fellow is now at the University of Newcastle, has done the same experiment in the UK, in South Africa, in Cambodia, in India. It seems to hold worldwide that people let loose with encouragement learn unbelievably more through intrinsic motivation than through the school system. Really kind of worrying. When they learn it in a group, the retention levels over 6 months are extraordinary and not like the memory drip that we all have in our own situations that really makes us forget things very quickly. So I'd just like to round out, because the little bells are going to go, with what I thought of my school, because I've been institutionalized since the age of 4. So I moved from Germany to Canada aged 4. I don't remember, but I was told I did not speak any English at all, which is probably true, because I was a German kid. I think I learned it in about 6 months. In primary school, I remember a teacher who made us do Scottish sword dancing. I don't remember much else about primary school. My second primary school, I was kicked out of class for being too clever by half. Remember orienteering and maple tree sapping, but I remember they wouldn't let me write. So I hated that teacher. At junior high school, I remember putting chairs on desks and tying string around all the chairs so that when the teacher we didn't like took one chair down, they all fell down. That got me into a fair amount of trouble. In junior high school, I remember dropping a stink bomb in a music class because I didn't like that one either very much, so that got me out of that. At secondary school, I was still in the enriched class, although I should have probably been in jail by then. And I remember being held back or being chastised for not coloring in some outline map of North America with my pencil coloring in the same direction. It didn't seem relevant to me, so I went. So I dropped out of that secondary school as well, and ended up, and this is fascinating to me, back in the day when there was money in the educational system, in an alternative school in Toronto, that was like a university for little kids, or for 16-year-olds, in a primary school. So the toilets were all about that high for 6-year-olds. I remember the good and the bad of this. I don't remember the normal of any of that. I think that normal part just kind of came and went. But the inspiration were all the opportunities and differences that I could have, rather than all the things that were really institutional. And I think, looking at the time, I'm not going to witter on forever, if we can really try over the rest of the day and when we're back in our day jobs to superimpose the different layers of education that we face, the reality of how the brain works, the reality of the needs of babysitting kids until whatever age they are, the reality of how knowledge is free and how that changes systems, the reality of institutionalization and credentialing, because you're still going to get a job if you went to Harvard more easily than if you went to East Northwest XYZ state. There's something about us having a label, about how all this plays out in the workplace with work-based learning. And it's a really tall order to bring those things together. But I think for all of us who are involved in the new ecology of education, we have to do that every now and then, whether that's on a quiet weekend morning or over a gin and tonic or somewhere, because I really do think we're in a very disruptive time, Schumpeterian, in how education is going. It will throw up a lot of opportunities, but it will ultimately make a lot of old models very, very obsolete. Thanks very much.
I just want to put forward a thought to you. There's this very popular notion that attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. How do you think this will pan out in the world of learning? In terms of deep learning, will people still be interested in Henry VIII? Last year, the New York Review of Books had a cover story that said, Google is making us stupid. What are your thoughts on this?
I worry a little bit about that because there's a kind of superficiality in life. I grew up in Toronto, so I'm allowed to make fun of the States. It's one of the requirements for having grown up in Canada. I find there's a lot of superficiality that goes on. You read the papers, they're a bit dim. You listen to the news, it's a bit dim. So there's a societal problem there. It's impossible genuinely to multitask. We cannot play with 5 devices and pay attention to all of them at the same time. Neuroscience and memory studies indicate that you need to repeat 6 or 7 times until you retain something. So we do need to find a way of creating that deep learning, but about valuable things, which is about analysis rather than memorization, about problem identification and looking at the different aspects rather than about how Kai colors in a map. And I hope we can take the space in HE to do that. I can just give you a very short example. We work with a lot of executive education clients at Ashridge, and we started experimenting with taking more and more stuff out of a classroom setting and left the participants from the Foreign Office more time to interact with themselves. The less we offered, the better ratings we got from a learning perspective. So with tongue firmly in cheek, I went to them and said, I'd like to charge you £15,000 a day without any input from us at all. Is that a deal? They didn't quite go for that, but there is something about less is more, but then the focus. And you can learn that quite quickly, but that is what we should be teaching rather than random facts of all kinds of rubbish.
Professor, thank you for giving us a very enlightened approach towards education, starting with neurology. As we understand today, I don't know about Britain. People are talking about the left and right hemisphere of the brain and teaching whole brain approach. I don't know whether there are any developments that you come across in Britain. One. Second question you mentioned is early childhood education. Why you put a child of 4 in the school and formal education, etc.? What we know now from Health University, some work being done in Edith Cowan University in Australia on learning through play. So has this development also catch on in Britain where you come from? So could you enlighten us a little bit on this? Thank you very much.
I will do my best. There's no such thing really as a left brain, right brain in the popular terms. I hope you have both sides of your brain, because otherwise you'd be a bit lopsided ultimately. But there is something about a different capacity to visualize, to learn, to analyze, to be creative, but they kind of flow across different elements of your brain. I could go on for this for a long time, but I won't. There's something about the reinforcement of processes. So if you're constantly doing accounting and are very analytical, to then have a brain suddenly go creative is next to impossible. And if your brain's all over the place for 20 years, really doing focus is impossible. It's just the way it is. With play, why do we put kids to school age 4? Because it's babysitting. Yeah? There's no other reason. Why do we make them learn things? That I don't know. That just seems to be some sort of Victorian thing about the cane and blackboards and chalk and trying to learn things and learn by rote, almost a Sunday school, Presbyterian Methodist tradition. I can't think of any other reason. Canadian schools were all open plan, so we sat around cross-legged on the floor doing God knows what for many years, and it didn't seem to do us too much harm. I'll let you all be the judge of that. It certainly wasn't learning in aged 4 in some sort of a structured way. It was about play.